Okay, so there are kind of a few primary like categories of things that I wanted us to touch on today. One of them was, what direction do we want like our ideal future version manager that's officially supported and supported on all the platforms and so on. What do we want that to look like? And that's a longer question that doesn't need to be fully answered today necessarily, um, or at all really. But the that conversation probably will have the most bike shedding and debating about use cases. So I'd prefer to save that one to the end if that's okay. The main other group I wanted to talk about before we got to that was talking about specific projects. Um, the Basically the original impetus for this was that um, I've been maintaining NVM for a number of years. Um, Tim, the original author of it, has not been involved, not in a while. Um, and the project to me seems like it would benefit from having code of conduct, governance, not really resources, but maybe the like testing infrastructure that Node uses and things like that. And so my thinking was that I'd like to see it go into the Node Foundation, since that seemed to be the best foundation, most appropriate foundation for it to go to. So I raised the question, and as I feared, there was a lot of distraction around other version managers, of which there are many, and we all know those. So my it sounds like the Node CTC or TSC, I can never keep them straight. There are a few members of those groups that are hesitant about bringing in a project like NVM into the foundation, um, without first getting some direction around what do we do about other projects. Um, and a number of you, I think, maintain some of those other projects. So my hope was in bringing NVM in was not at all, of course, to squeeze out other projects. It was to just like primarily move that one project into the foundation, and then the goal of developing some sort of more holistic version management solution to me was a separate thing that moving NVM in would assist, but not. I didn't see the two as coupled, but a lot of people seem to think that they're very tightly coupled. So I wanted to kind of get everybody's thoughts on um, if if you have one of these projects, or if you use one of these projects, like, do you think that they would be interested in coming into the foundation? Do you think that they would care one way or the other? You know, what are people's thoughts around that?
So I do want a note on like
Mhm.
the the idea of like a more holistic thing, or like that NVM is like leading into that or whatever. I think that's partially driven by the fact that like I don't know, the installers we have aren't that great. So like the installer project is like there to have like a better GUI installer, but it's kind of stalled out partially because like the actual you like actually managing the versions behind that kind of needs to be backed by something. And I think some of that conversation is probably driven by that fact.
Got it. That makes sense. So I know, Corey, you maintain NVM Windows, and I think you posted some things on that original NVM thread. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, my real thoughts are just that the holistic approach seems like the more appropriate first step, not because of really the tech or anything, or the projects, but just simply because at the moment NVM doesn't have Windows support. So that was really where I was coming from. And since there are some differing methodologies or different approaches on how that can be done, I feel like really kind of setting standards is really the first step. And then whether or not the projects adhere to that or not, that's what my initial thoughts were, more so just so that we're not repeating things as we go along. Because I think whether we bring projects into the foundation or not doesn't really matter, but I do think that we need to serve all Node users. So that, not excluding any particular operating system that Node officially supports. So that's really that's the basis that I was coming from, just making sure that everybody is covered, really.
Right. So yeah, and I'm totally on board with that. I think there's differing views on like not differing views. How do I put this? Different people have different things that are top of mind for them. I agree that that if NVM were to come in and then NVM's choices for better or worse were kind of enshrined as this is the way version management is done, then that would not, especially because of a lack of Windows support, but just in general because it wasn't designed with everyone in mind initially, that would not be a good thing for Node users as a whole. But I don't anticipate that happening. I see it as actually somewhat necessary for the project. So, at the moment, if I, for any reason, am unavailable on the project, or if Tim is for any reason unavailable, or if either of us doesn't want to be involved, or gets burned out or something, if anything were to happen that's unforeseen, then the project's screwed, and all of NVM's current users, which are a decent subset of Node users, are screwed as well. And so moving the project into the foundation helps protect those because it creates a path to resurrect the project or gracefully transition people off of it if necessary, if something like that were to happen. I don't want any of those things to happen, but I'm trying to be cognizant that those things can happen. Yeah, Jeremiah.
I'd like to note that that's kind of like exacerbated by the fact that like our install story is really not that great, and so like at least on like Unix platforms, typically what we'll say is to use NVM because it's just easier.
Right.
So I mean, we're kind of like even telling our users to use these version managers. So, kind of, yeah, if we're gonna rely on that much to like even install Node, it's kind of important.
Right. And then I mean, there's no reason any of these things has to happen sequentially. Like we can totally work on standards with or without specific projects entering the foundation, but I don't see them entering the foundation as slowing that work at all. And I don't think that work needs to be a precursor to those things coming in. And so that's and it does seem like what you the way you said that, Corey, was kind of lightly of the mind that work needs to be done before a project comes in, and that seems to be an opinion that a few people share, and I'm trying to understand that because I don't share that.
Hey, Jordan, I'd like to pose a question to you, and it's meant in the most genuine way possible. What are the benefits that you see NVM and other version managers will have being directly in the foundation?
Sure. So in general terms, which I think apply to this, any software project that's in a foundation gets a large number of benefits. It gets the benefit of licensing knowledge and research that's been done. So, any licensing questions, foundations generally provide guidance there and have, Node Foundation being part of the Linux Foundation, there's a lot of legal staff available to assist. And these are issues that nobody cares about most of the time, but when it does pop up, it's a huge deal. Number two is like governance. So most software projects tend to be at the whims of their maintainers. If I decide like to become a bad actor for some reason, like I mean I can just go close pull requests or delete features and break people, and that doesn't really matter. I mean that does matter. It affects people, but there's nothing anybody can do to stop me except for Tim. And similarly, if Tim decides to do something like that, he could go delete me from the project and delete all the features and so on and so forth. Like all these things can happen, and they're unexpected, and nobody wants them to happen, but they do happen. There's been large maintainership issues with a few projects. Notable ones we don't need to go into. So I think governance is a big important one.
So as a follow-up, why then the Node Foundation as opposed to, for example, the JS Foundation?
Well, NVM has nothing to do with JavaScript. It's written in shell scripting, and it's managing Node, which does, of course, run JavaScript, but like that's a somewhat tenuous link. And at the time that I made the request, the JS Foundation didn't exist. But I also don't think it's the most appropriate place for it. Certainly, if the Node Foundation is not interested in hosting the project, I've been working with the JS Foundation for quite a while, so I mean I would seek putting it in there, but I don't think that would make any sense. for it.
Yeah, no, so the only reason I mentioned that in particular, and I mean, I'm already wanting to support you on this.
Sure.
Sorry, hold on one second. It was more along the lines of, I think one of the biggest things that we've struggled with, obviously, is avoiding a conflict here, and not trying to support one over the other. And then, the project itself has struggled as a foundation, figuring out where projects that are not core fit in. But at the same time, we have things like builds, we have bots, we have all these things that when started by the foundation make a lot of sense to live there. But it starts getting a little conflicted when we talk about bringing in projects that already exist.
Totally, and that is something that the Node Foundation has struggled with, but I've never really understood why, because most foundations gladly host projects that aren't core. I mean, the Node Foundation already has Express, and nobody has seen that as like.
It's not in the foundation though, for what it's worth.
Okay,
it is not.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, it was brought in as a mentor project, and Jeremiah may be able, or William actually would probably know the exact details of it better than myself. But essentially, we brought in Express as a mentor project to help them figure out, building a governance structure. But it was not an official member project.
Okay. That's a good distinction to note.
And I think the important thing about the version manager is the question of whether or not one day Node will ship with a version manager, which I have received phenomenal feedback about wanting that. I've never seen a reactions so strong about it before from developers. So that was really interesting. So I think the desire is out there, and if that's the case, if Node's going to be shipping it, if that's ever a possibility, then I certainly think being in the Node Foundation is the right place.
So we actually talked about this at, I guess this was at the TSC meeting. Now this is not really TSC domain I managed by shipping it, but like it was suggested there that probably we could ship something just fine that wasn't in the foundation under that. Like we ship npm already, right? So we might do that regardless.
Well,
that's
there's
just up to someone to champion.
There's a desire for npm to be in the foundation too, but that's a little bit more complicated.
Right, but that's not.
We also ship cares, and we ship V8, and we ship all of our dependencies. I think that's more what Jeremiah, npm is a bit of a red herring there as an example.
Well, I don't think so though, because npm is like a lot more similar than the other dependencies, and the other dependencies like you don't directly invoke, like Node kind of like runs with them, right? But npm is like this other tool that ships with it. So I mean, then our installers, not the actual package, the actual package probably would not come with it, but the installers would then give you like an option to install using a version manager per se.
I think
I might actually make a pull request with that if everyone's okay with it, to at least get discussion.
I think whatever version manager would be shipped, I would hope it would have a good infrastructure for testing, building, and Jordan had mentioned that early in the call, and the Node Foundation has that as well. I'm not sure the JS Foundation has that to offer. Maybe. I haven't heard that.
I'd like to take a quick second and address Jordan's question from a while ago in regards to really where a starting point is for this, because, especially in this call, we may not identify what the best approach is going forward with anything. But the reason that I've been advocating setting up standards initially is more so from all the confusion that I've seen with users. So with the NVM Windows project, the biggest mistake I made was actually calling it NVM Windows, because it's not exactly the same as NVM. There's a fair number of differences. And I've seen a lot of confusion, not just within the version management community, but more recently with Yarn. There was a lot of confusion on how to identify what actually is, how do you identify what node or what a node installation actually is? On Windows, do you look in the registry to identify the version, or do you look at a file path, or those kinds of questions were coming up. So there's some confusion as to what actually defines a node installation. So I think that's why I've been advocating starting with standards, because what that would allow us to do is at least come together on the same page, and the existing projects out there could either adapt to that, as opposed to kind of setting a standard. So, we have that problem where we've got several different node version managers out there that all do a great job, but they are tweaked in an opinionated manner. Whereas if we have a standard that we can all come around, then we can move forward without restricting ourselves to a specific workflow or to a specific ideology. So Jordan, I hope that addresses the original question that you had, but to me, that seems more fundamental than necessarily bringing in a project. As much as I'd like to see, several projects involved, because I also agree, and I can probably echo the same sentiment that Jordan has had about, NVM Windows would definitely benefit from the same things that Jordan was discussing, whether that be governance or, testing infrastructure, any of those kinds of things. It'd be fantastic to have something along those lines. But again, taking a step back to back to standards seems like more of that baseline where we can all come together. And so I just wanted to clarify that before stepping forward with anything else, and hopefully answer Jordan's original question there.
Well, so I think that does. Do you see bringing, NVM or NVM Windows or any other projects in as something that would impede that progress?
The only concern I have with that is, what does that say to the public? Because it's not like, if we say, okay, NVM or NVM Windows or Noticed or any of those other, any of the other projects come in, is that the standard? Because there's unfortunately a lot of people just make assumptions about things. So it would need to be clearly delineated that this is just a project that is coming in, and then the standards are separated. And I think if we made that delineation clear, then maybe there isn't a problem. But I'm frankly just concerned about assumptions, because I get users all the time that are posting issues that they have with NVM because they tried to install NVM on Windows as opposed to my project. So they get that confusion point there. And again, that goes back to just my personal experience in a very poorly named project in retrospect. But that's more of my concern, is the assumptions that people make about how, this is how versioning works here, or versioning on Travis works this way because it uses NVM, whereas in IEVM it's using NVM for Windows, and so it's those confusion points that I'm just concerned that we're going to have a mess of people that just don't understand how to use things, and we actually aggravate the problem as opposed to fixing it. So that's my only concern. But I do think that if we could clearly delineate the difference between, this is the direction that we want to go with versioning, as opposed to these are the projects that are supporting it, then I think we could I don't think it would be in impotence at that point.
Awesome. Okay, I think that makes sense.
I never quite understood, or rather, I would say standardization is important for me, but standardization across managers feels kind of unnecessary, because if you have multiple managers that implement the same standard, then what's the point of having multiple managers? But standardization from the point of view of, we want to have a version management approach that works for all platforms, is kind of desirable, I think. However, the question is, if we choose, or if NVM becomes part of the Node Foundation, the question is obviously, does that mean that it's an official solution for Node, or does that just mean the foundation is kind of like a sponsor? It funds the project or helps it go along.
I think that's exactly the question. Thank you, Marcel. I think that typically that is exactly what it means to be in a foundation. It does not mean this is official or endorsed or the only way. It is supposed to only mean the foundation is caring for, in some way, the project. And I think the Node Foundation is concerned about sending a message that, this project or that project is kind of blessed, but that concern only arises because they have not yet adopted projects. And I think that as the Node Foundation adopts projects, that concern will completely evaporate, because it will be very clear that these things are not, blessed solutions.
Mm-hmm. Is NVM the standard right now? I don't have the big picture.
NVM has the widest usage, I think, and I only claim that because of its Travis CI installations. Outside of Travis CI, and if you perhaps correct for the bump it probably gets for being used there, I suspect it's probably no more common than any of the others. Certainly not, but the top three, as I'm aware of, for Linux at least, are NVM, N, and Nave. And there are a few other smaller projects, and then there's NVM Windows is the only one I know of for Windows at this point. There has been others in the past, but I think they're all defunct. But the popularity isn't really the concern as much. I mean, like somewhat in the sense that Travis CI is driving a lot of NVM installs, but I mean, I have commit access to their cookbooks and stuff, so like we can make changes there if needed.
I'd like to just add to that really quickly. I don't know if this necessarily has to do with popularity, and I don't speak, for the entire core team, but for myself, when people are on a Nix system and are having issues with Node, especially around versions, NVM is my go-to to suggest, and I've played with a whole bunch of the different version managers, and primarily because it's written in POSIX, so there's no possibility that a botched Node or NPM instance on the machine is going to cause a problem. So that's always been, for me, what has kind of put it at the top of my list for suggesting, because that way, if people are having system issues, they can drop NVM in, and then if that shims the path, that usually can like allow them to start moving forward without having to like figure out what they botched on their system itself. I do think some of the solutions that we've talked about moving forward, such as an installer, a double-click installer that can handle version management, may make something like that a moot point. Something like an Electron-based version manager is something that I could see working really well. It's one of these kinds of, it's a bit of a catch-22. I see a lot of value in the version manager being written in JavaScript. I, for one, have tried to dig into the NVM source code, and it's hard, like it's all POSIX. It's not a friendly thing to jump into. Whereas if we had something that's written in JavaScript, that would be way easier for people to jump in and get involved in.
Sure.
But you do have this chicken and egg problem. And to me, at least right out of the gate, the value of being able to run the installer on most systems without having to have anything installed outweighs the benefit of making it easier to contribute. Now, if we move towards something like having a double-click installer or an Electron-based version manager that can do things using UI, we move into a different area where things become a little bit simpler. This is for myself, Marcel, where I actually see a lot of value in some sort of standardization. I was the one who would open the threads specifically around standardizing how we are shimming the path and standardizing how we are actually storing the information on the system. The reason why I think that is important is that giving a path where people can pick different version managers, there's an advantage to how it's implemented, what language it's implemented in, how it's implemented, implementation details. But if you have a standardized path and a standardized location, someone could use a double-click installer to install it. They could then use something in their toolbar for switching between versions, or use something like NVM to switch between versions.
Right.
When NVM itself is running, is not really doing anything. All it's doing is changing the path. So standardizing these things would really simplify being able to have multiple tools that can work together at various levels in the stack and at various complexity, because we have users who want to live in the command line. We have users who would love to have something in a UI. We may even want people who want to do it programmatically. And so having a baseline for that could really simplify things,
Yeah,
in my
I think
opinion,
that's
at least.
super important. But for what it's worth, I think regardless of where NVM lives, for NVM's users, separate from the discussion of how many there are, because that's not really relevant, I would need there to be a migration path. And so whether NVM is in the foundation or not, the things that are important to me are the use cases, not the implementation details. And as long as NVM users' use cases are met, then I will happily transition, figure out a transition path to get people over to it. So as to there was an earlier question, I think Marcel asked, is NVM the standard? I don't think that matters. I think that that the use cases NVM serves are critical, but I think that the use cases that every version manager serves are likely critical. And I think that that process of researching that and figuring out what are the use cases that are important, command line or GUI or Windows or Mac or, Raspberry Pi or, all those things, like getting a complete list of that is important. And I think that as we make that list, all of the projects should try to converge at that point to where Marcel's comment was, if we have a standard that multiple version managers are implementing, why have multiple ones? I think that's exactly where we want to be. We want to get to the point where the standard is sufficient such that it doesn't matter that there's multiples anymore. And then we have, and then we can just kind of pick one of them as the official implementation or build a brand new one according to that spec and everything's solved. Or we never have to do that. And we can just say, cool, now we've got this standard, like promises A+ and all the promises libs out there, or, whatever. So I think that it is definitely critical, as Miles and Corey have said, to move towards a standard. We should be slow and cautious about standardizing things because we are definitely going to run headlong into use case conflicts if we're not careful. But I think as we do that, we have the opportunity to get all of these projects in the ecosystem to converge on these standards. And I think, and so to me, the process of figuring out the holistic official solution and the standards therein is a long, slow one, and it needs cooperative effort between as many version manager authors as possible to try and drive that. So I guess I'm totally on board with that message. I just, I still think that NVM would be best in the foundation in the meantime. And I totally agree with confusion, Corey, as a problem. I get NVM Windows users filing bugs on my repo too. And that's a big issue, but that's going to be an issue regardless. And especially because of the existing user bases of all of our tools, we're always going to have to provide a migration path or be screwing over some people. And so I think that if NVM went in the foundation tomorrow, I would want it to be tightly coupled and loudly coupled with a bunch of messaging around, this is not the standard for version management. This is not a blessed project. This is not the only one that should ever exist. This is just the first step in caring for version manager projects in the ecosystem so that the Node Foundation as a whole can get a complete picture of all of the important use cases so that we can evolve towards an ideal solution for everyone, for all Node users. Like that's, maybe there you go, there's your headline, but like something to that effect. And so my hope is that we can everyone will agree that type of messaging will relax any concerns about confusion and stuff and so forth.
That's certainly something I can get behind.
Awesome. There's been a number of people who haven't had an opportunity to talk. Please take the time now. I think if you have something to say, want to make sure we get everyone's voice heard.
Hi, this is Jason. There's one thing I wanted to talk about related to discussion around standards. I wonder, how would it be possible for standards to avoid dictating a specific switching mechanism, like as in changing the path or using symlinks or shims? And if the standard dictates a certain mechanism, that kind of excludes version manager tools that use a different mechanism.
That's a good question.
Do you think that can be reconciled?
I think it can. I mean, the idea that so let's say we hypothetically came up with some pathing scheme for Windows and Linux that said, if you have a Node version, this is the path that it must be installed under. That does not preclude symlinking that to some other path or using a shim to proxy into that path and so forth. Like both NVM solution and a shim solution, for example, don't care where the actual binary lives. They're intercepting the request somehow and then making sure that that command gets, hits the correct binary.
Yeah.
So I don't actually see a conflict there. It certainly might, if we're not careful, create a situation where some version managers are penalized because they have to jump through extra hoops to make their approach work. And I don't want to do that. And that's part of why, like, I think we need to get as much input as possible before making these standards and, setting a direction, because we don't want to do that. And like this is the same problem that JavaScript itself has with browsers. It's really difficult to sometimes make language decisions that don't overtly penalize some browsers for their implementations. And tail calls and Edge is one such example. So like I want to avoid making those mistakes here. And I really think the only way that we can even have a hope of doing that is to get a complete exhaustive list of, all the ways people like use, like that XKCD with the spacebar and the overheating of the computer, like figuring out all the things that people are doing and try to use that to inform a future facing choice. And that's part of the reason why I don't want to rush into making a standard as well, because as soon as we say this is a standard, it becomes really hard to walk back from that.
So one thing that I do want to add to that, especially around the idea of symbolic links, for example, I think that if we were working towards a standard, we would try to be working towards something that would work cross-platform, and symbolic links in particular are one that doesn't.
They do.
They do.
They do. I've actually implemented symbolic links on Windows and Unix in a consistent way in the NBS tool.
I think, does it not require NTFS and?
It does require NTFS, but
okay.
Virtually everybody on Windows today uses NTFS.
Right. Yeah, and so that's, I think, if in fact that is a place we can be where all Node Windows users are on NTFS, then Symlinks seemed like a great solution. I wasn't aware that that was the case, but that's something we can look into, I think, as we go.
Thank you for correcting me on that.
I think the Symlink feature was added some time ago in Windows, but I'm not sure with which version that came. So I would be cautious about Symlinks, but you might know more about that. Sorry.
I don't remember exactly when it came, and maybe Jason even has more information on this than I do, but I do know that the vast majority of the user base for NVM Windows is it basically starts at about Windows 7 and forward. I thought I had a couple of users even on earlier editions than that.
Yeah, Windows XP and Windows 2000 absolutely have Symlink support on NTFS. Right. It's possible that older ones do too, but I don't remember much farther back than that.
Okay. Then that's good.
Cool. Okay. Miles, go ahead.
That was a total misclick. We're all good.
No worries. Chris, George, do you have anything to share that you haven't had the chance to yet?
Chris here. So there was one point that I didn't 100% agree with, or at least, or probably, or I think, or at least it should probably be refined. Let me correct myself. Because I think I forget who it was. We talked about how I think it would be nice to have the Node, the NVM in JavaScript or some form of NVM in JavaScript, but then it could be a chicken and egg problem. And Envy, I looked at NVS, does seem to, does have a solution. Is it the right solution? I don't know, but it did have a solution for that very problem.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, I'm pretty impressed with the simplicity of it, and I think that that is likely to overlap heavily with whatever our final solution is. But that our whatever the solution we arrive at is. But um, I suspect that we will run into some difficulty with edge cases for that approach, but that's something that I think it will show itself over time as we get more information. And I think that's okay. And I also, for what it's worth, I think it will be okay if we end up in a situation where we do have enough standards so that people can write cross-platform tools, but maybe the Node installer prompts one of 3 different version managers based on your needs. Like maybe that's the solution we end up being, and then we don't have one size fits all version manager, but we have enough version managers to cover all the use cases that interoperate cleanly. Like, I'm not sure. I think that NVS's approach will likely cover a lot, but there are likely as well use cases where it won't work, because of the footprint of running a Node installation or the weight of downloading it or so forth. And I think we can explore those more deeply over time. But I think NVS is the closest we might have to an ideal implementation so far. I'm certainly excited about the possibility of not having to ever write POSIX again, let me tell you.
That's kind of where I was coming from, to be honest, is seeing NVS really really solve these problems. Made me, just made, did make me extremely happy. Again, to be honest, yes, there are a couple things I think could probably be done, better, in terms of, I think in terms of downloading an old version of Node and then using a new version. I don't really, I don't really like that, to be honest. But otherwise, it's at least you did something.
Right. But yeah, so and I think that should be part of our long-term conversation about how we want the like ideal solution to look. And but I do want to retain that it's important that we like the goal is to serve all Node users, and NVM does not do that. NVS does not do that. NVM Windows does not do that. We all try to serve our niche the best we can. But I think that we need that if we want to come up with a blessed solution, then we need to be very careful not to exclude anyone that Node officially includes. If that makes sense. So yes, like I think NVS is a great model, and I think Jason has really good work at it. And I think that that will likely heavily inspire what we want to do, because that's, I think, the first really viable implementation of that approach, which is awesome.
Absolutely.
So I want to mention, like, this is really like even another step forward in my mind, because I mean there's not much really that unified in Node installs as it is right now. Like, you have a Mac installer that installs it a certain way. You have a Windows installer that installs it a certain way. You don't have Linux installers, but you can install them through package managers. I guess really if they're the ones that we build at NodeSource, but there's other ways you can install, like just the raw packages. So I'm like, personally, I'm not really sure if it matters that much, at least on that end of things. So like if the Mac installer installs a Mac version manager for it that works a way that's compatible with Mac OS, and then the Windows one does it a way that works best with Windows, if that's really a problem. I don't even know what to suggest for Linux. I guess it's like install a shell script or something.
Right.
Yeah, I mean maybe the packages for Ubuntu and Debian could include whatever that might be then, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to note that as long as the experience on the same machine for the same user is consistent across the tools that are available to them, then I think we will have achieved quite a lot, even if things are not identical across two different computers.
Yeah, I think to build on what Jeremiah was saying, I do think that we don't need to pigeonhole ourselves into making a single solution for all platforms if that doesn't prove to be the best way of approaching it. Now, if NVS is showing that there is a path forward on that, that's great. But at the same time, like if we can get like the installers that we have, and Jeremiah didn't get too far into it, but I mean, like it is really bad legacy stuff. We have a massive issue right now, for example, with the OS X installer, where there is no way that I have at least been able to yet digging in, get the installer to remove files before installing, which means the node modules npm folder doesn't get removed before it gets reinstalled. And this has left us in this terrible case where we have artifacts that are left over between installs and has caused really, really, really weird edge cases. So to me, having a semi-bespoke solution that performs better on a platform and is better for that particular platform as an install option. If we have a generic installer that's built in Electron, just as like a high level idea, that in itself allows you to select from a group of, version managers that all work somewhat similarly. I see that as like a great win. I don't think that like if it's going to take us months to figure out how to solve this in a cross-platform way, I don't know that we need to necessarily focus on that.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, at least from like the shipping node side of things. I mean, maybe my perception is just wrong, but I feel like that like file systems on Unix and Windows are like really quite different in like where you put everything into install. So like, I mean, the install story is always going to be a little bit different, even if you're running the same tool, right? I think like the biggest thing is like for like platforms that are really similar, you kind of want a way that you can be like, oh, you're on like a platform that's like this. Well, here's generally like how you would debug a problem. Maybe that's not the correct thinking, but
well, I think even in that world, like file paths are different, but the core path module provides consistent interfaces that abstract that away. And I think that it's total like on Windows you have the registry, and on you like Linux you have environment variables and like there's lots of different ways to configure things, and I think it's fine if those are different, but whatever those are, we need to be able to define them in such a way that it's possible to write a clear abstraction around them so that tools developers and users potentially don't have to deal with that.
That's something I've dealt with when developing NVS, trying to implement equivalent functionality on Windows and non-Windows platforms. Most of the code, of course, is cross-platform, but major differences, of course, are when you want to edit the user's profile path, you either edit a bash RC file on Unix or you edit the Windows registry profile in Windows. And then if you want to link to a system location, then you link to program files on Windows or user local on Unix. There are differences like that, but you can generally find equivalencies and abstract them away.
Right. And that very knowledge of those equivalencies and what those problems are is a huge thing to bring to the table. So like I think that's going to be a very useful discussion. Cool. All right. Well, we got 10 more minutes slotted. Yeah, William, go ahead.
I guess a topic that that I probably should bring up from the TSC call for anyone that didn't listen into it. It was, Rod had mentioned what he really doesn't want to see in the Node Foundation is to have anything brought in that just goes dead. And then it's just some code that's no one's maintaining, and it's just sitting there. And I think I got the sense that many people were against having multiple things pulled in. So just throwing that information out there. It was
I mean,
my takeaway from the meeting.
I guess my thought is that as the Node Foundation, if people are using a project, it would be like the foundation is the correct place for it to rot instead of somewhere else if it were to rot. In other words, I don't see any. I still don't understand what the problem would be if that happened. Like, I fully intend on continuing to maintain NVM for the foreseeable future, but like, if NVM were living in the foundation and not maintained, like that's I think a far better scenario than NVM sitting on some random person's GitHub and not being maintained, because all of its users are much better off if it's in the foundation, because then the foundation can come in and mark it deprecated, or it can come in and help, and instrument a transition or whatever. I can certainly understand not wanting a flood of projects to come in to just like quote be in the foundation, but I don't think that has to happen, nor do I think that acceptance of a project or two projects or three projects in any way guarantees, or forces the foundation's hand in accepting a fourth project. And if necessary, I think with each, induction, it can be made very clear this is not setting a precedent. This project on its own merits, for its own, for these reasons should be in the foundation and so forth. I guess in other words, I see that the entire purpose of a foundation is to create a place where code can live, whether it's maintained or not, that is relevant to the users that make up the foundation. Like, otherwise, why make one? Maybe Jeremiah or Miles or William, you can shed a little more light into why that is an objection, or what the fear is. Like, so what if there's some dead projects? Like, what's the downside?
Well, again, I'm just trying to echoing my what I derived out of sentiment. I think it was more like what was it, Node.js, something like that was pulled in, and there's been dependencies on it, and when something goes wrong with it, there's just the problems sit there and continue to be problems that people complain about and nobody addresses, and so it just becomes more management of things that are just being brought up as issues and never addressed, and it kind of a negative vibe to it. I think that's that was my takeaway. Miles, maybe you have more.
So I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent from there. So Jordan, it may not be entirely clear for those who are not heavily involved in the foundation, but the foundation's still even just kind of figuring out what it means.
Miles, you're cutting out for me a little bit. I don't know if that's just.
Hold on. Is that better now? Can you hear me better?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So it may not be entirely clear externally, but the foundation's a year old, and we're still in the process of figuring out what it means to be a foundation. So this is all public record. If you go and look at the recent CTC and TSC meetings, we're even discussing whether or not those two bodies should be folded in. There's discussions about what the entire governance structure of the foundation itself looks like. And within that comes this whole idea of like, what is the purpose of the foundation? And right now, it's very much trying at the same time to define what Node is. And what I think part of the struggle here and problem here, and this is part of the reason why Express was never brought into the foundation proper, in my opinion, and this is not, on the record facts, but we're still trying to figure all those things out, right? Like, so Express is a slightly different thing than a version manager, in that like it would be a completely tangential thing to the project itself. And so there would be no clear way that we could say, hey, this has its own governance, it's over here doing its own thing, but it's like within the foundation, because we don't even know what that really means, or at least I don't. And maybe William and people on the TSC or the board may have a better idea about that. But as far as I know right now, the foundation is primarily just housing Node, and everything that falls under that right now, like the thing that's furthest from core that we have in there is maybe like our build infrastructure, but it all directly serves Node itself and the release of Node and the maintenance of Node. So I think that unless we were in a position where we were shipping a version manager, is not entirely clear. Now, I think a version manager at the same time, though, is probably the closest thing that we've had that has expressed interest in joining that makes sense. But it still could fall under the idea of a tool. So like where does a version manager, as opposed to like an installer, stand from a testing library, like aside from a cert, if that makes sense as a comparison?
I mean, so as a comparison, I would look to the parent foundation of the Node Foundation, the Linux Foundation, which does not by any means just contain Linux core. That seems to me to be the most obvious place to find an answer for what the Node Foundation should be.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that is what has been the primary struggle of getting things in.
Mhm.
That the foundation needs to answer that question before we can bring things in. And it is taking us a while to get to that answer because we're still figuring it out.
Okay.
William, do you have anything you can add on that? Because I think you have a little bit, or Jeremiah, because I don't really sit in on the TSC meetings, so there may be some context that I'm missing.
I just someone touched on this earlier. I think really comes into this, whether it's a project that's pulled in or a project that's created under Node. Because we do have a lot of tools when you consider some of the things we have for postmortem and something to that effect, that people are working on. Things have been started under Node, and they're fine. They're not disputed. But pulling something in is just, I don't know, for some reason, so much different. And certainly some of the things that have been created under Node are in what I'll call rotting. And so it's kind of a strange thing. I don't really know the right mentality to have around those things, but for some reason the external projects have bigger trouble, and I would like to have more discussion with the TSC, like what is the difference here, what are we talking, and I think it has to do with licensing maybe, but I don't know that for sure. Just a point of correction though, the Linux Foundation isn't a parent to the Node Foundation.
What is the relationship between the two?
The Node Foundation hires the Linux Foundation for consulting services.
Ah, okay. I was unaware of that. Thank you for clarifying.
Yep.
I still think it's the right place to look for the answer to what the foundation should be, but that is not as obvious a direction given that correction. Thank you.
Right.
So I think licensing is not that big of a concern. I think concerns are like existing ecosystem competition and also like just general responsibility for stuff that the people who are currently doing, in the foundation and the TSC probably don't have time for. Like if it was just abandoned. And I guess like as an extension of that, like we don't really want to become like a place where like everything just comes and sort of dies. So
of course not. I mean, that's not the ideal.
Yeah, I mean we haven't really wanted to be in the business of like hosting, deprecated or dead projects.
But like if that were to happen, all you would have to do is say this project needs an owner. If it does not have an owner within X period of time, we'll make the repo private, or I don't know, whatever makes sense for that project, and spin it off to someone else. Like it doesn't have to stay in the foundation forever. That's just like the whole purpose of it being there is because it should thrive there. And if being in the foundation is somehow worse than being out, then it shouldn't be in there. But I don't think we need to fear a project dying. Like any project could die. Node.js could be dead. Like if something better comes along or whatever. I think that's okay. I think when that happens, you move the better one into the foundation and you perhaps move the worse one out. Corey? Did you have
Yeah, just as a point here, as far as looking for, I guess, examples or precedents, in my opinion, I kind of look at the W3C a little bit as a potential example for where the Node Foundation could go, or where we could go as well. And that's, again, focuses back on the whole point of standards. But the point is that if there is concern about a project or something that is going to die, or is dead, or whatever the case may be, the standard can still live on. And that's not something that necessarily needs to be, you're not dealing with code or anything of that nature. That way, it just gives people some direction that they can follow along with, which is the same with web development and everything. Thus, the W3C, is the example here. So I really just wanted to toss that out more as an idea. I don't really have any specific direction with that, but as far as what we're doing, that would kind of solve a lot of potential conflicts, at least in the early days, and maybe it evolves from that point. But just giving people rules, I think, is a that they can follow and adhere to and trust in. It's really about making Node reliable, right? So that I don't know, just take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. A standard will and should live longer than the projects that implement it. Yeah, I guess, yeah, there's, yeah, okay. I think we'll need to have more chats with the TSC or whichever to clarify those concerns over time as well. Okay, well, we're just about out of time. I think maybe we should do another call in a couple weeks just to touch base. But we'll probably wait to schedule that until there's new developments. Is there any thoughts anyone has before we close off?
Just a quick point, if anybody's around for Node Interactive, here in Austin, it might be a good point to meet up as well for anybody that can make it.
Cool. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for your participation. We'll figure out how to get this recording posted later, and we'll all be in touch. Take care.
Have a good one. Thanks for setting this up.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.